They told him his name was on the list. What they didn't say was that some names are written in ink and others in pencil, ready to be erased. The room was a sterile, unforgiving white, a blank page where the final chapter of Elias Washington's life was being written against his will. The only color came from a child's drawing taped to the bedside table, a crayon sun smiling with defiant optimism. His wife, Lena, held his hand, her fingers a warm, living anchor in the cold ocean of the hospital. His own hands, which had once shaped wood into art, now lay limp on the starchy sheets, strangers to their old strength. The door opened, and Dr. Alastair Finch entered, a man built of sharp angles and quiet authority. He moved with the frictionless confidence of someone who had never been told to wait. He carried a tablet like a stone commandment, his eyes scanning it before they fell on Elias, a brief, clinical assessment. "Mr. Washington," Finch began, his voice as sterile as the room, "about the donor heart that became available this morning." Hope, that treacherous flicker, ignited in Lena's eyes. She squeezed Elias's hand. "It wasn't a match," Finch said, the words perfectly spaced, offering no room for argument. "We had to allocate it to another patient. A more suitable candidate." The phrase hung in the air, heavy and cold. More suitable. Elias had heard those words before. They were the ghosts that haunted this ward, the quiet justification for the faces he saw leave while he remained. Lena leaned forward, her voice tight, respectful but refusing to bend. "More suitable how, doctor? His blood type was a match. You said so yourself." Finch gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh, the kind a man gives when forced to explain the obvious to a child. "It's more complex than blood type, Mrs. Washington. There are antibodies, tissue markers, a dozen variables. The algorithm selects for the highest probability of long-term success. It's a matter of science, not emotion. Science." The word was a shield. Elias closed his eyes, the weak, erratic rhythm of his own heart a mocking drumbeat in his ears. He knew the language of systems, of measurements and calculations. He was a carpenter. He knew that even the most precise ruler could be used to draw a crooked line if the hand holding it was unsteady. And he had come to believe the hands running this place, this system of life and death, were profoundly, terrifyingly unsteady. Finch saw him not as a man, a husband, a father, but as a data point with a failing heart. And in the cold arithmetic of this hospital, his data just never seemed to add up. There was a time when Elias's hands were the truest part of him. Calloused, scarred, dusted with the fine powder of cedar and pine, they were instruments of creation. In his workshop, surrounded by the sweet, earthy scent of sawdust, those hands had a language of their own. They could read the grain of a plank of oak, coaxing out its secrets to build a cradle that rocked with a perfect, gentle rhythm, or a dining table that would hold the weight of family feasts for generations. He built things that were meant to last. Now, lying in the sterile silence of the cardiac care unit, he would stare at those same hands for hours. They were thin now, the skin translucent over the blue network of veins. A constant, slight tremor ran through them, a testament to the storm raging within his chest. He, a man who had built his family's home from the foundation up, could no longer hold a cup of water without it rattling against his teeth. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just his heart that was failing. It was his identity, crumbling away with every weak, fluttering beat. Lena would watch him, her heart aching with a pain so deep it had no words. She would see him trace the old, faded scars on his knuckles, a slip of the chisel here, a brush with the saw blade there. Each scar was a story, a memory of a life lived with purpose and strength. Now they were just relics of a man he was no longer sure he would ever be again. Life in the hospital was a slow, agonizing erosion of time. Days bled into nights, marked only by the changing shifts of nurses and the rhythmic, metronomic beep of the machines that kept him tethered to the world. That beep was the soundtrack to their lives, a constant reminder of the life he was losing. Maya, their 16-year-old daughter, was their lifeline to the outside world. She would arrive after school, her backpack slung over one shoulder, bringing with her the scent of autumn leaves and the chaotic energy of teenage life. She tried so hard to be brave, spreading her textbooks on his bed, chattering about teachers and friends and the drama of the school play. She'd read him chapters from her history book, her voice bright and clear, trying to fill the quiet, sterile space with the vibrancy of her own life. But Elias saw the fear in her eyes. He saw the way she would glance at the heart monitor, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second when the rhythm skipped. She was fighting to keep him in her world, but she could feel him slipping away. The nights were the worst. The hospital settled into a hushed quiet, and the darkness gave his fears room to grow. "Maybe this is it, Lena," he whispered one night, his voice a dry rasp. "Maybe my time's up." She sat on the edge of his bed, her silhouette a pillar of strength against the faint glow from the hallway. "Don't you dare say that," she said, her voice fierce, a fire in the dark. "You are a fighter, Elias Washington. You fought for me, you fought to build our life, and you will fight for this. We fight. Do you hear me?" He heard her. But the fight was a relentless thief, stealing his energy, his hope, his very breath. The humiliation was a constant, bitter pill. The bedpans, the sponge baths from strangers, the utter dependence on the people who moved around him with detached professionalism. He saw the pity in the eyes of some, the impatience in others. Then came the new patient down the hall, a white man, maybe 45, who walked into the ward on his own 2 feet, laughing on his phone. His name was Mr. Davies. He'd been on the transplant list for 6 weeks. Elias had been waiting for 7 months. 2 weeks later, Davies' family was celebrating in the hallway. They had a heart. Lena saw the balloons, heard the joyful cries. She stood in the doorway of Elias's room, her ledger of injustices tucked under her arm, and watched them. She began to ask more direct questions, her voice losing its respectful edge and gaining a sharper, colder one. She cornered Dr. Anya Sharma, a young cardiologist on Finch's team, in the cafeteria. Dr. Sharma was different. She looked at Elias like he was a person. Her eyes were full of a tired empathy that the other doctors lacked. "Can you explain it to me, Dr. Sharma?" Lena asked, her voice low but insistent. "Explain how a man who walked in here last month gets a heart before my husband, who can barely sit up on his own." Dr. Sharma fidgeted with her coffee cup, refusing to meet Lena's gaze. "The allocation process it's very complex. There are factors." "I'm tired of hearing about factors," Lena cut her off. "I want to hear the truth." Dr. Sharma looked up, and in her eyes, Lena saw a flicker of something: guilt, fear, a conscience at war with itself. "I can't," she whispered, and hurried away, leaving Lena standing alone in the middle of the bustling cafeteria, the cold, hard truth beginning to settle in her bones. The system wasn't just complex, it was compromised. The call came at 2:13 a.m., splitting the thick silence of the hospital night. A voice on the other end, urgent and clear. A donor. A young man in a motorcycle accident. The match was almost perfect. Same rare blood type, exceptional tissue compatibility. The word perfect echoed in the room, a sacred promise. Hope, raw and overwhelming, flooded back into their lives. It was a physical force chasing the shadows from the corners of the room. Lena sobbed, pressing her forehead against Elias's, her tears of relief baptizing his face. Maya, woken by the call, rushed to the hospital, her face streaked with joyful tears. For the first time in months, they weren't talking about surviving. They were talking about living. They talked about the garden Elias would plant in the spring, about the family trip to the coast they had postponed for years. The hospital sprang into action. Nurses bustled in and out, their movements crisp and purposeful. They drew blood, checked vitals, prepped Elias for surgery. The air was electric with anticipation. Elias, who had been retreating into a quiet, gray fog for weeks, was present again. The light was back in his eyes. He squeezed Lena's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I told you I wasn't done fighting," he rasped, a weak smile on his lips. Hours passed. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and orange. They waited. The initial buzz of activity had quieted into a tense, expectant stillness. Every footstep in the hallway made them jump. Then the door opened. It was Dr. Finch. He didn't need to say a word. The energy in the room collapsed, sucked into the vacuum of his presence. His face was a blank, unreadable mask. The tablet was back in his hand. "There's been a change," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Lena stood up, her body rigid. "What change?" "The donor heart has been diverted," Finch stated, his eyes fixed on his tablet, not on them. A more acute emergency case arose at another hospital. The regional allocation board made the final call. A more acute case. The words were a lie, and they tasted like poison in Lena's mouth. She had overheard two nurses talking at the station just an hour before, their voices hushed but audible. They spoke of a patient, a wealthy man, a major hospital donor, whose condition had taken a sudden, though manageable, downturn. His name had been pushed to the top. It wasn't an algorithm. It was a phone call. "No," Lena whispered, shaking her head. "No, you can't." But they could, they had. Elias didn't speak. He didn't rage or cry. He simply turned his face to the wall, pulling his hand from Lena's. The light in his eyes went out, extinguished as if it had never been there. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound Lena had ever heard. It was the sound of a man breaking. Not his body, but his spirit. He had given up. And in that moment, Lena knew that if she was going to save her husband, she could no longer afford to be respectful. She could no longer ask for fairness. She would have to take it. The despair of that morning forged something new in Lena. Grief and fury merged into a cold, hard resolve. If Elias had lost the will to fight, she would fight for them both. She would not let him die in the quiet, polite prison of this hospital. She would burn it to the ground first. She went to the hospital gift shop and bought a simple black and white composition notebook. On the first page, she wrote in neat, block letters the ledger. She became a ghost in the ward, a quiet observer. She documented everything. The names of new patients, their race, the date they were admitted, the date they were discharged, or the date their families received flowers. She sat in the waiting room, listening. She made small talk with other families, gathering pieces of their stories. Her notebook filled with names, dates, and diagnostic codes she looked up late at night on her phone. Her ledger was no longer just a collection of facts. It was a testament. A pattern began to emerge, stark and undeniable. Mr. Peterson, white, 68, admitted May 3rd, transplant May 19th. Mr. Chen, Asian, 52, admitted April 12th, transplant June 1st. Mr. Henderson, black, 61, admitted February 8th, still waiting. The disparities were glaring. Armed with her grim accounting, she found Dr. Sharma again. Not in the bustling cafeteria this time, but in a small, forgotten hospital library, surrounded by dusty medical journals. Lena didn't raise her voice. She simply opened the notebook on the table between them. "Look at this," she said, her voice low and steady. "Tell me I'm imagining it." Dr. Sharma stared at the pages, at the neat columns of names and dates. She traced a finger down the list, her face pale. The numbers didn't lie. She couldn't deny what was right there in black and white. Her professional composure crumbled, revealing the raw, aching conscience beneath. "I knew it," Dr. Sharma whispered, her voice thick with shame. "I felt it, but I didn't want to believe it." "Belief doesn't save my husband's life," Lena said, her voice cutting through the quiet room. "Action does. Will you help me?" That night, a quiet alliance was formed under the dim library lights. Dr. Sharma, risking her career, began to pull the official allocation data from the hospital's encrypted servers. She worked after her shift ended, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and conviction. The data she uncovered was a bombshell. Over the past 2 years, during Dr. Finch's tenure as head of cardiac transplants, white patients at St. Jude's Medical Center received donor hearts, on average, 34% faster than black patients with the same or higher medical urgency scores. The hospital's own data condemned it. The algorithm Finch had hidden behind was either deeply flawed or being deliberately manipulated. It wasn't science. It was a modern-day lynching, carried out with spreadsheets and surgical precision. They now had a binder 3 inches thick, filled with charts, graphs, and the damning stories of families who had been told to simply wait their turn. Lena closed the binder, the snap of the plastic rings echoing in the silence. The waiting was over. The boardroom was all polished mahogany and muted tones, a chamber designed to absorb conflict and project an aura of impenetrable calm. Lena felt out of place in her simple dress, but she held her binder like a shield. Dr. Sharma stood beside her, looking younger and more fragile than ever in this room of gray-haired men, but her eyes held a new, steely resolve. They presented their findings to the hospital's chief of medicine, Dr. Wallace, and 2 members of the ethics board. They laid out the numbers, the timelines, the irrefutable pattern of discrimination. The air in the room grew thick with discomfort. Dr. Wallace steepled his fingers, his face a carefully constructed mask of concern. "This is disturbing, of course," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "But transplant logistics are incredibly complex. These numbers, taken out of context, can be misleading. There are clinical nuances." "Are you calling my husband a nuance?" Lena's voice was quiet, but it sliced through his platitudes. "Because from where I'm standing, he's a dying man who has been pushed to the back of the line time and time again." They tried to discredit them. They painted Lena as an overwrought, emotional wife who didn't understand the science. They portrayed Dr. Sharma as a naive, ambitious junior doctor manipulated by a grieving family. They promised a thorough, internal review. A phrase Lena knew was a synonym for a deep, dark grave where inconvenient truths were buried. She walked out of that boardroom knowing she had hit a wall, but she also knew there were other doors. That afternoon, she met with Sarah Jenkins, an investigative reporter for the city's largest newspaper, a woman with a reputation for breaking stories that powerful men wanted to keep hidden. Lena handed her a copy of the binder. "The hospital wants to review itself," Lena said. "I think the public should do the reviewing." The story exploded 2 days later. The headline ran across the entire front page: "Hearts of Darkness, Racial Bias Allegations Rock St. Jude's Transplant Program." The article was brutal, meticulous, and backed by the undeniable data Lena and Dr. Sharma had compiled. It featured anonymous interviews with nurses who confirmed Finch's god-like control over the allocation process. It told the stories of other families of color who had lost loved ones while waiting. The hospital became a fortress under siege. News vans camped outside. The phone lines were jammed with calls from outraged citizens and national media outlets. The carefully curated image of St. Jude's as a beacon of healing was shattering in real time. While the storm raged outside, Elias was fading. He was moved to the cardiac intensive care unit, a world of perpetual twilight and the constant, urgent beeping of machines. His body was shutting down. His kidneys were failing. His breathing was shallow, a painful liquid rattle. The doctors, their faces grim, gave him days, maybe hours. Lena, Maya, and Elias's brother gathered around his bed, a small, heartbroken constellation. They held his hands, spoke to him in low, loving tones, their words a desperate prayer against the encroaching silence. Lena read to him from his favorite book of poetry, her voice catching on every line. She was preparing to say goodbye. At the same time, on the top floor of the hospital, the board of directors was holding an emergency meeting. Dr. Finch, summoned from his office, walked in with his usual arrogance, ready to dismiss the story as journalistic sensationalism. But the reporter had done her work. She had recordings. She had sworn affidavits. Finch's carefully constructed world of clinical nuances and complex algorithms crumbled under the harsh light of evidence. His colleagues, the same men who had protected him for years, now looked at him like he was a liability they had to cut loose. He was suspended, effective immediately, escorted from the building like a common criminal. The old power structure had fractured, and in the ensuing chaos, something miraculous happened. A call came into the CCU. A donor. A 19-year-old boy killed in a tragic accident. His organs were healthy, strong. He was a perfect match for Elias. Dr. Sharma, who had been appointed interim head of the department in the shake-up, took the call herself. There was no committee to consult, no algorithm to run, no Dr. Finch to intervene. There was only a dying man and a chance to save him. Her voice, when she turned to the CCU nurse, was clear and unwavering, ringing with an authority she had earned through fire. "Prep Mr. Washington for surgery. Now." The victory wasn't loud. It didn't come with applause or triumphant speeches. It came in the quiet, steady rhythm of a new heart beating in Elias Washington's chest. Weeks later, he sat on his back porch, the late afternoon sun warm on his face. He was thinner, and a long, pale scar traced a path down his sternum, a map of his journey back to the living. But he was breathing, deep, effortless breaths that filled his lungs with the sweet scent of freshly cut grass. Maya sat beside him, reading a book, occasionally leaning her head against his shoulder. Lena came out of the house carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She set them on the small table beside him and her hand rested on his. He looked at her, and his eyes, clear and bright again, held a universe of love and gratitude. He didn't need to speak. She had heard his heart speak for him. On the table was a small block of cherry wood he'd asked Maya to bring from his workshop. He picked it up. His hands, still bearing the old scars of his trade, were steady now. He ran his thumb over the smooth, cool grain, feeling the life in it, the promise of things yet to be built. He held the wood in one hand and with the other he reached for his daughter's. He laced his fingers through hers, a strong, solid grip. The carpenter's hands were back. The camera holds on his chest, where beneath the soft cotton of his shirt, a faint, rhythmic pulse is visible. A strong, steady, undeniable beat, the beat of a heart that had not only survived but had won. His name was on the list. Now it was carved in stone.